So let's look at some different tips for creative writing, which can really get your mind flowing, and some skills practice for your 8-mark creative response in the comprehension section. The first tip is to use interesting and unusual adjectives. So for example, instead of using the adjective red, you might use the adjective crimson. Even though it means the same thing, that difference in how interesting it sounds and just how unusual it is makes your writing a bit more out of the ordinary. For example, you can use, instead of the word beautiful, the word vibrant. Things like that which just make your writing stand out and more interesting to read. Secondly, you can describe all 5 of your senses. It's really important to appeal to the reader, not just by telling them how things look, but really how things relate to all of the different senses so that they can imagine that they're in the scene. So you're thinking about helping them paint the scene in their own mind by using different techniques. This way you can describe how things felt, smelt, tasted, and sounded like, not just looked like. So you put yourself in that scene and you're imagining everything and then using that in your own creative writing. Thirdly is the concept that the devil's in the details. So by this, what we mean is that the worst writing is the writing that's really broad and really vague, because that leads to boring responses which no one's particularly interested in reading. What you want are detailed, interesting responses that are full of life because of language techniques, description, and interesting ideas which no one's really thought about before. For example, you could say, "I walked up the path." Yep, so you're getting the idea across, but that's not particularly interesting. Instead, you could say, "I almost tripped on the broken stones on the pathway that led to the old house." How much more interesting is that? You're basically saying the exact same thing, except just because of the language and description you use, you've entirely changed the meaning and the reading experience for whoever's looking at your story. Simple things like that. Fourthly, you really need to think and to sit back and develop a persona. Usually you're going to be writing in first person. As I've said, you're not really writing a short story, but you're more likely to be writing in another form, like maybe a diary entry. So you're always going to be using the forms I and me. And as a result, your persona has to be interesting, to be engaging, and so people want to read it. You also need to create a tone for your character. Remember that your characters don't always have to be nice. You could be writing from the perspective of the villain or someone who's sad or upset, not necessarily just someone who's a bit normal and happy. Really mix it up and choose someone interesting to write in the perspective of. You can make your persona seem believable and realistic through adding the details which we've talked about. Fifthly, you must show and not tell. Now, we briefly discussed this earlier, but it's really important that you don't tell the audience what's happening, but instead you describe it to them. And you use little symbols and hints which could suggest to them what's actually happening. So it lets the audience use their imagination more. For example, you can say, "I was nervous." Or you could say, "I was chewing my fingernails." Now that difference between those two examples, they're both showing that the person is nervous. However, they're showing it in different ways, because in one it's just telling you that he's nervous, and one it's giving you a bit of a hint and asking the reader to take from that the fact that he's nervous. Sixth, you can vary the start of your sentences. Get a bit of variation, and that adds a bit of colour, tone, and interest to your piece. So, don't just start your sentence with the same word all the time, because this becomes quite boring and uninteresting to read. Instead, for example, you shouldn't always start with "I" or "he" over and over again.